Hi everyone and welcome to the AllAboutU podcast. I'm your host Ubuhle Nyati, and in today's episode we'll be speaking about something that is on the rise amongst Gen Z, millennials and the overall youth. Joining us today is family physician, CEO and founder of Proactive Health Solutions, resident doctor on 702 Saturday morning show, known to many as Dr Fundile, to my closest friends as the legend, and to me, as my bestie, is Dr Fundile Nyati. Dr. Nyati, it's a pleasure to have you here joining us on the podcast to speak about vaping.
Good day, Ubuhle, and good day to all your listeners. I'm happy to be here.
Dr. Nyati, when I think of the word vaping and break it down, I think of the word vapor. And vapor just being, the gaseous form of water.
Yes.
This gives me, an idea of a harmless or safe practice. What are your thoughts around this?
Well, you're actually right. The choice of the word vaping was not a coincidence. It is a word that was deliberately and strategically chosen because, yes, when you talk vapor, to most people, that's a harmless, kind of, chemical, H2O. But in the context of the habit of vaping, what comes up as the vapor or the cloud is certainly not harmless. There's a lot of chemicals there that are actually harmful to various parts of the body. Nicotine, for starters, is very, very addictive to the brain. You've got solvents there, formaldehyde and benzene and other chemicals like those. They are harmful to the body, especially the nervous system. You've got other chemicals there, metals, nickel and others that are also, carcinogenic. That is, they cause cancers. So basically, to reduce this to vapor is actually misleading because, the chemicals that are contained therein, individually and collectively, they do harm to various parts of the body.
I see. Yeah. And so earlier, we spoke about how there's a rise amongst, I guess, the youth in general. Some have referred to it on social media and on various platforms as an epidemic amongst the youth, which is crazy to think about, but also true in the same sense because when you walk into malls or even garages, you see these products being advertised almost in every corner you turn.
Yeah.
With the blueberry ice flavors and menthol flavors and watermelon flavors. But before we dive right into what it is, for those who maybe don't know what vaping is, but they identify these products at these different locations.
Yeah.
What exactly is vaping and how is it different from the traditional tobacco cigarettes?
Well, vaping is a relatively new habit. In 2014, the word vaping was actually voted the word of the year. That just tells you that it's still a very young, habit that's run about 10 years old, certainly less than 20 years, of the practice. Now, vaping is really the act of inhaling into the lungs the vapor,
Yes.
in inverted commas, what we call aerosols that is produced by an e-cigarette.
Yes.
Now, obviously, the question will be, what is an e-cigarette? Because, we're talking of vaping, but what is an e-cigarette? It's an electronic device, that heats up, the e-liquids, producing an aerosol or a mixture of small particles in the air. So vaping is that habit of inhaling these aerosols produced by an electronic device called an e-cigarette. Yeah.
And sorry, just as you're mentioning, you see some people on social media mocking these vapes by calling them, flavored USB sticks. But, being in the presence of a doctor and using my basic knowledge of the respiratory system,
Yeah.
there has to be a deeper underlying issue and health concern with the use of vapes, despite their popularity.
Yeah.
To such an extent that if one looks at the American Addiction Center's website, nicotine, the drug which you spoke about, amongst heroin and alcohol, methamphetamines and cocaine, are ranked as the top 5 most addictive drugs.
Indeed.
And this clearly indicates a danger behind these vapes. What effect does it have on the human body?
Well, I think you've just mentioned that, in the US, the scientists, they have ranked nicotine amongst the top 5 of the most addictive drugs out there, in the same level as things like, methamphetamines and others like that. Now, so that's one of the things that you find, or chemicals that you find in these vaping products. Highly, highly addictive. It just takes 10 seconds to get to your brain, and when it gets to your brain, obviously, it helps the brain to release happy chemicals like dopamine. And so that rush that you get from those happy chemicals, it makes people feel good. It makes people feel better emotionally. Those who are on the low, it really makes them really feel good. And the more they do this, the more the body gets used, or the brain gets used to these chemicals, to a point of what we call tolerance. And when you reach a point of tolerance, then it means you need more of the same to achieve the effect that you had before. So over time, you're getting to have more of the puffs, more of the vapes, to achieve the same effect that you had. And that thing of having more of the chemical over time to achieve the same effect, it's a definite, road towards addiction. And so, yes, the biggest problem then is that, especially with brains of people who are under the age of 25 that have not yet developed, what we call the synapses, that is the joints between the different nerve cells. So that interference with the synaptic activity, the connection between the brain cells, is actually a problem. And that's why we then worry about the effects of nicotine on the brain in terms of, the addiction that we see. But the effects don't end there. Yeah. Again, it affects one's mental health, the risk of, one suffering from things like anxiety, from things like depression, from substance abuse, because others graduate from vapes to, cigarettes, to dagga, and later to other drugs. So substance abuse becomes a problem that is now on the mental health side. On the respiratory side, these chemicals, they cause a whole lot of different problems within the airways. They cause inflammation, acute inflammation, chronic inflammation, that is swelling in the different cells that line the airways, especially in the SX at the end where the gas exchange takes place. And in some instances, people have actually died from the acute reaction following, the inhalation of these, something that is called EVALI, EVALI. It's an acute, damage to the lungs, which requires one to get into a health facility as an emergency, and that. Unfortunately, almost 3,000 people in the US have been recorded to have died from that. But besides that, generally, it just causes, damage and scarring of the airways, which over time will affect the person's ability to exchange, carbon dioxide for oxygen.
As we're speaking about this, you spoke about mental health.
Yes.
So also, what I'd like to include in this conversation is why we're seeing a rise in, Gen Z and millennials and the overall youth, vaping. Coming out of COVID, one would think that, each person would value their health a little bit more, but it seems not to be the case. When we look at a study that was done in 2016, by, I think, the SA Democratic Health Survey, that showed that only 2.5% of adolescents were vaping.
Yes.
But 7 years later, we're seeing a change in this. A recent study was held in Cape Town by Professor Dr Fundile Nyati, of respiratory medicine at UCT, which showed that amongst 5,500 students from affluent schools, that revealed amongst 1 in 4, or 25% of matriculants were vaping.
Yes.
This is a very rapid
rise. That's an exponential increase.
Yes.
From less than 2% from around 2% in 2016 to almost 25%, in 2022, which is just about 6 years later. Yes. But that just shows you why we say this is an epidemic. Of great proportions, and it is something that if it is left unattended as a risk, then we may actually be, facing one of the biggest challenges to affect our young people, and that, for example, is a major problem in terms of the future health of our young people.
And so when you speak about this and, understanding the rapid rise in it, why do you think this is so? Like, what are the drivers behind this rapid rise?
Well, I think it is not, coincidence that we're seeing this rapid rise, especially amongst the generations you've spoken about, the Gen Z, the millennials. Generally, especially the young ones, the Gen Z, they are impressionable. They are at that age where, they want to belong to groups, and belonging to groups also means you get involved in some of the things that are done by the group to belong and to be accepted. So the issue of peer pressure becomes, an issue for this kind of, people. But also others may already be having health challenges, mental health challenges, depression, anxiety, and so because of that feel-good factor, after you have, taken the vape, some of these people who had pre-existing mental health challenges, they actually feel better, when they have taken a vape, and
Is
so
that from the release of dopamine?
Yes, the release of the dopamine and the others like serotonin and other chemicals in the brain. So that feel-good factor to people who had borderline or low-grade depression and anxiety, it makes them feel better. So it's almost like some self-medication, of some kind. So basically, there are a number of psychological factors that are driving, the young people, but also there's just the whole issue of drug experimentation at that age, of teenagehood, adolescence. There's still a lot of experimentation, that takes place, and so once again, there is this. But I think what's important is for us to know that the industry itself targets the young people. If you look at the ads, whether it is print ads or online ads, these ads, they are so sleek. They use the kind of colors that grab attention, and the whole experience is presented as something that is so harmless, yet so interesting. And if you look at the flavors that are actually on offer, they are very, very interesting. I mean, there's new flavors almost every month, so all of those things, especially the issue of the flavors, it's directed at the youth, who have never, most of them, smoked before. But these things, they taste nice, they appear harmless, and so they easily hook, these young brains that have not yet fully developed. And that is not, again, a coincidence. It was and still is a deliberate strategy, because then from there they grow into other forms of smoking, that is cigarettes, the cigars, the hookahs, and other illicit drugs.
And I suppose the influence of social media has kind of added fuel to the fire.
Indeed.
With the trends of smoking these little circles and
yes,
all of these
there's.
tricks.
I mean, if you look in the social media, TikTok and in other channels like that, you get a lot of competitions about how the kind of vapes that you can make and inhale, and basically some art in the way of producing the vape, and how it looks, so all of those things, as people compete to try and come up with the best vaping tricks, in the process they are inhaling huge quantities of the aerosols that are actually harmful.
Would you also suggest that using these vapes to maybe suppress emotion is a self-destructive form of escapism?
Well, in fact, that's what I should have said from the beginning, that when people are stressed, there are a number of coping mechanisms that they are involved in. Basically escaping from the reality is one of the common coping mechanisms. It is a destructive coping mechanism, because whilst you are trying to escape from your current problem, but what happens is that you then take that drug, commonly alcohol, but vape is also one of those drugs that people can take, and so it makes you feel good, it makes you feel like you've forgotten a bit about your current challenges, but sometimes it can even worsen your problems, because the health challenges that may come from this form of coping, which is called escapism, can actually worsen your original problem, or you find that you've got new other problems that were not there before.
And what I'm hearing from this is that these vapes are pretty problematic, or at least more problematic than they are advertised to be. But
well,
the question
it is intentional.
Yes.
Obviously the interest is to increase the number of people who are vaping. That is the industry. So they would not talk about the downside of vaping because that's working against their interests. Their interest is to have more customers, and not just more customers. Those customers must use more and more of these vaping products, and therefore it would not make sense for them to actually say anything that is negative from a health point of view. So, but I think for people like me who are health advocates, whose mission is to, help people to make informed choices about, their health, we have a professional and ethical duty to tell the truth, based obviously on what has been proven. And so there's a lot of literature, especially from the US, the UK, Australia, and other countries where the practice of vaping is now much more established. And when you look at that literature, published literature by scientific researchers, it's quite scary. And here in South Africa, we are still at our infancy in terms of doing proper scientific research, on the downside of vaping. But that doesn't mean we can keep quiet. We have now, we live in a global world. We are able to access information about what's happening, in Canada, in the US, in Europe, and other parts of the world. And it's better that we at least share that information, so that those who choose to continue, at least they are doing that, knowing that they have been warned. So my duty, I see my duty as a family physician and a public health advocate as that person who must share information. I did that during COVID-19, even before COVID-19. In the shows that I participate in, especially where I'm a resident doctor on 702, every week I share information that will help people to make informed choices. But we can't force people to stop habits that are actually not good for their health. The least we can do is just to make sure that they are informed, and whatever decision that they take, then at least they must be prepared to deal with the health consequences down the line.
And just following this conversation, earlier I spoke about how you can find these products almost in every corner you turn, at the garages, at the malls.
Yeah.
But when we talk about the Gen Z population getting their hands on these products, how is it that, they're many of them may be under the age of 18, but are getting their hands on these products? What are the regulations around this, or is it a case of considering that there's a lack of regulation?
Well, you actually are raising a very, very important point. Now, in South Africa, I'll just go back to 1994, 95, when the new government came in. The Minister of Health at the time was Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. She was our first Minister of Health. Now, one of the things that she did that South Africa, should credit her for, was that against a lot of pressure from many, big companies, she was able to come up with legislation to discourage people from smoking cigarettes. She's the one who championed the whole thing that people can only smoke in designated areas so that they do not affect others with passive smoking. So since that, which was almost 30 years ago, the level of cigarette smoking in South Africa has indeed gone down. It's no longer socially acceptable, for people to smoke cigarettes generally. Now, you bring in then the issue of vaping. So vaping, basically the dangers are similar. Yeah, they're not the same, but they are similar. Now, when one looks at these dangers, both in terms of the person who is using the vape, and also those who may not be vaping, but who may inhale secondary smoke, those aerosols that have got chemicals. It is therefore, imperative that the country moves quickly to regulate, the advertising relating to, vapes, to regulate the access, that is where these are sold and to who they are sold. That is, for example, under 18s should not be able to, to buy these products. You shouldn't be able to just get them at each and every corner. Yeah. So there is a bill of parliament. I think, there is a bill of parliament, Tobacco Amendment Act, that's being considered there, which is meant to introduce regulations in South Africa. I wish that process can move faster, because other countries that have now been ahead of us in terms of this epidemic of vaping have now come up with, regulations that control the access, and also things like, marketing and the misleading marketing that you find from the industry. So I think South Africa has to, quickly, approve that bill so that it becomes law. The only challenge, though, is you can have the law, but how do you enforce it? Even now, kids under the age of 18, if they want to buy cigarettes, they can buy cigarettes, even though that they're not supposed to. There are a lot of unscrupulous, shops that will sell these products to underage, kind of people. But the first step is to legislate and regulate. Then I think the second step is, how do you enforce the law? So, but I'm glad at least that there is a process that's underway that is meant to ensure that, in the near future, it won't be a free-for-all like we're seeing now. I mean, there's online, shops that deliver. And so a child doesn't have to even leave their home to get a hands on these. If they've got access to a credit card, especially those who come from affluent families, then they can order these things, online without the knowledge of their parents, and they can continue to use them at home, because most of them, unlike cigarettes, they may not really have a particular smell, that would alert the parents, to the fact that their child is actually, vaping. In the same study that you quoted, there is something there that says at least about 30% of those who were vaping, within an hour of them waking up from sleep, they have to get their fix of vaping. So that shows you, and at least 25% of the very people, they cannot finish a school day without vaping. So what I'm trying to say then is that we are dealing with a serious problem, and it's a problem that others are still not taking seriously, but the damage that is happening to our young brains is going to come back to haunt us, in the next decade or two. And so we have to do the best we can to discourage, the young people from taking up this habit, even though they may be teased for not being cool enough, for being stiff. But I would rather be labeled cool or stiff than to actually sabotage my health and my future. Well, obviously, I'm talking now as an adult, but I wish there could be more of the young people, this Gen Z and the millennial group, that actually thinks the way I do.
Yeah, and I also think that speaks to having a strong sense of personal identity.
Indeed.
That's something that the young people, even being impressionable, finding the space to just grow your personal identity is very, very important.
Indeed.
To avoid, getting into these bad behaviors or picking up these bad habits.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, this whole thing talks to parenting in the new millennium. Parenting at this age is difficult. We have high-paced lives as parents. Often both parents are working, or even if the other parent doesn't work, but you have a situation where that parent who's not working, it's not like they are idle. They are busy, managing the home in many ways. And so you find then that parents don't have adequate time to actually sit and be aware of what's happening in the lives of their kids, on a day-to-day basis. So often we hear of kids who are, teens who are committing suicide because they've been depressed, and you find that the parents were not even aware that their child was actually, depressed or anxious. There's a whole issue of, online bullying. There's a whole issue of bullying at schools and in other social settings, which can actually turn kids to have, health challenges on the mental health side. But because we're not in touch with what's happening on a daily, with our kids, by the time we wake up, it sometimes is a bit too late. So I think it starts, therefore, with us as parents. We need to prioritize time with our, teenagers, with our adolescents, with our young adults, because for as long as we don't spend that time with them, when they reach teenagehood or even adolescence, then they become much more open to external influences, and make decisions that we don't understand. How were they part of that? Because we're not there for them at home. We just give them money to, as a substitute, for our absence. And these guys who sell these products and even illicit drugs, they know that kids who go to that kind of school or that kind of school, affluent schools, they tend to be cash flush. So they introduce some of these things, and even hard drugs to them. So rather than, just thinking that by giving money, we are actually parenting our kids, let's actually spend time, get to know what's happening in the lives of our kids, get them to open up without judgment, about what's happening in their lives. I would rather my child speaks to me about the challenges they are facing on a daily, than for them to think that the only people who will listen are the friends out there, because I know that I've got her interests at heart or his interests at heart, but I'm not necessarily sure if all of the friends have my child's interests at heart. And so the point I'm trying to make is, I think as parents, we need to, in our busy schedules, find time to be in touch with our kids, because once they know the right and wrong, by the time they get to the age where they may easily be influenced by peer pressure, at least there's some solid, moral grounding that makes them to know that even if they don't follow the crowds, there is nothing wrong with that. And if being accepted in the crowds means they must embrace practices that are not good, then they would rather not, they'd rather lose those friends. And so I think rather than just focusing on the kids, I think the foundation at home, parents must stop outsourcing parenting to the schools, to the church. It must start at home. And then the school and the church and other places augment what has been started at home. So the point I'm trying to make is that let's be there for our kids. Let's help them make the right decisions. Let them not fear coming home and sharing, about experiences that they may have, come across. And even when they have made mistakes, let's not be harsh. Let's try and understand what could have influenced. It's better that than to wake up and you find that your child has committed suicide.
I think that's a very important message, especially being in such a fast-paced world where, there's social media and you're scrolling. You can find yourself scrolling for hours and, be influenced by these many different things. The foundation at home is really what's most important to
Indeed.
Make the correct or informed decision as well.
Yes, indeed.
But before we, close, what advice do you have for those who are considering starting vaping, for those who are addicted to vaping, and for those who'd like to quit?
Well, like I said, we're up against very strong, slick marketing. The amounts of monies that these companies that produce the vape products are spending, to try and attract and hook, especially the young people. It's a lot of money. And so it's important for us, though, to say, if you have not started the habit of vaping, which is sold as a harmless habit, please do yourself a favor. Don't even start. Yeah? Don't even start. Better be safe than sorry. We always talk about prevention is better than cure. And the first step to prevention is, awareness creation and knowledge acquisition, so that when you make that decision, it's a decision that is actually informed. So I'm saying try and get as much information about vaping as possible. Some of the schools are now starting to create awareness about vaping, so that when you make that decision not to, you know why. So if you haven't started, please don't do it. If you were experimenting, and it's something that's very common amongst teenagers and adolescents, to experiment. If you are experimenting, but you are not yet hooked, I would say it's never too late to stop, right? It's never too late to stop before the chemicals control you, before nicotine controls you and you have got no ability to stop because you are addicted. Before that happens, don't continue with experimentation. If you are already hooked, like those kids who within an hour of waking up must have a puff or two, a vape or two, who cannot finish a day in the classroom without going to the toilets at school to actually vape. If you are one of those, then it is it's a serious problem. You need to talk to your parents. They may judge you, but they will also be there to support you. You need to talk to your family doctor, or even a psychiatrist and a psychologist, to assess the level of addiction, and be referred to a facility that can assist you to quit. It's not easy because the withdrawal symptoms from nicotine addiction sometimes can be so hectic that even those who really wanted to quit, they may find it quite difficult to quit. But the bottom line is that eventually you'll be able to quit. If you already have damage to different parts of your body from the habit, then it's not only an issue of dealing with addiction, but it's also an issue of being under the care of a specialist in that area of your body, in that system of your body that may be affected. If you've got mental health problems, obviously a psychiatrist will have to be involved. If you've got respiratory problems, a pulmonologist may have to be involved. If you've got heart problems, because vaping people have got at least twice the risk of heart attacks than those who are not vaping. So you may need to be under the care of a cardiologist, and so on. So I think it's important to look at what stage are you in. Are you still outside looking in? You have not started? Don't start. You are already inside experimenting, but you are not yet hooked? Stop it. You are already inside and you are hooked? Seek professional help. You already have got damage relating to this, then on top of being hooked, you need specialized care. So I think that's the kind of advice. But as parents, some parents, they actually give these as presents, on birthdays, because they are not aware that these, vapes or vaping products can actually harm the health of their kids. So if you are a parent, please do not feed the habit, and try and ensure that your kid, quits the habit. But if you, as a parent, you are actually vaping yourself, it becomes a very difficult situation because you need to lead by example. And so you may also have to show your kid that, you're going to quit the habit. Because then if you can do that, then your kid will listen. But if you continue, then your message may not really be effective because you yourself are not a good example. You're not leading by example. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think that brings us to the end of the conversation today. But Dr. Nyati, I'd like to say a really, really big thank you to joining us on the podcast. It really was an informative and, enriching conversation,
Yes.
about vaping.
Yes.
I think many students, many young people, even maybe many adults may take a thing or two away from this conversation. So big thank you to you.
Well, I'm glad you have given me an opportunity, like I said, I'm a public health advocate, to come and share, and I'm not being judgmental. I'm just sharing information. It's up to each individual to internalize what we have shared, look at their own risk profile, and do the right thing. But we can't enforce. We just hope that through this, podcast, some who were contemplating or some who were still at experimentation stage will actually, quit the habit. And those who were already hooked, they will have the courage, to actually turn their backs on the habit. So thank you very much. And if in any time in the future you want me to come and share with your audience on any subject that is health related, whether it's about energy drinks, or anything really, I'm available to assist.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure this is definitely not the last time we have you on the podcast. So thank you so much for joining. And to our audience, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope that you've learned a thing or two from this conversation, and we'll see you next time. That's all from the All About You podcast. I'm your host, Ubuhle Nyati. Until next time. Bye.
Thank you very much.